Hello and welcome to another Redwall discussion. Today we are discussing Mattimeo. It's the third book in the Redwall series, or at least the third book in the publication order, the order the most true fans like to read in. It's a special book because it's one of the few true sequels in the series. Redwall books are usually set many generations apart from one another with few to no characters overlapping between them. Mattimeo, however, is set in the same era as the first book, meaning a lot of the characters from that book are still around. One of the good things about this book is precisely the joy of the familiarity of those characters, a joy so few Redwall books when you pick up a new one offer. I love that we get to know some of the minor characters from that first book a little better. For example, Ambrose Spike the Hedgehog. It's explained that he's a master of the cellars who maybe isn't the best authority on anything other than beer. Another character who we subtly get to know a bit more is John Churchmouse, the recorder of the Abbey. John is a young to middle-aged father who, unlike a lot of the other younger male characters in the series, is just kind of presented as an awkward nerd. There's no brave potential warrior in him. He's there, he's kind of awkward, and he knows a lot of stuff. He's helpful, but not in the way that most Redwall characters of his age and alignment would be. One of my favorite characters in this book ends up being Cornflower. So in the first Redwall book, Cornflower mostly just fills the role of fair maiden who the hero woos and ultimately marries. I like how in this book, Brian Jacques challenged himself to give her some personality. And while in the past two books, Jake certainly wrote strong female characters, he did that by quite literally making them strong and in a lot of cases a bit too into violence. I like the fact that with Cornflower, he found a way to sort of give her some independence and some quirk in a way where she never actually, I don't believe ever in this book, she directly engages in violence. Instead, she kind of outsmarts the bad guys and has a good time doing so. She basically does some cosplay and not only terrifies and annoys the bad guys, but also annoys the more straight-laced, serious people, i.e. Abbot Alf, on her own side. Finally, of the characters from the first book who get a decent revisit in this one, we get Constance the Badger. One line discussing Constance that I found particularly interesting comes on page 278 of this edition. So Redwall Abbey, as the sort of B plot of the book, is being attacked by this army of various corvid birds led by General Ironbeak the Raven, and Constance has just been tricked by General Ironbeak. And she says she can't believe she allowed herself to be tricked because Matthias, the hero of the first Redwall book, and also hero of this one, would not have allowed him to fall for such a trick. What struck me about that line is in the first Redwall book, Matthias is a real beginner of a hero, and he's a little mouse, and he's brave, but he doesn't necessarily accomplish that much in combat, whereas Constance is unparalleled. She doesn't need this title of warrior. She is just unequivocally the toughest, most threatening member of Redwall Abbey, and yet she has these insecurities. And is it because Matthias has genuinely surpassed her in skill in the time between the first Redwall book and Mattimeo? Or is it more just there's this weird way that despite being a very egalitarian society, Redwall has created this sort of new form of royalty by declaring Matthias their Abbey champion and the heir of the ancient Martin the Warrior? That means Constance, who doesn't have an equivalent title, looks up to him in ways that she probably shouldn't because she might be his equal or his better. It's hard to think that in the 8 peaceful seasons that transpired between Redwall and Mattimeo, that Matthias magically became like the greatest warrior of all time. No, he's just a little mouse who is brave and happens to have a sword of historic value. Now, that all said, let's talk about what's actually the main plot of this book, and specifically, who is Mattimeo? Well, Mattimeo is a young mouse. His name is actually an amalgam of his full name, Matthias Methuselah Mortimer, but he's only ever called in this book Mattimeo, and that's good because his father, again, the hero of the first book, is named Matthias. So from the get-go, what sets Mattimeo's story apart from most or all other Redwall books is that it is very much revolving around this character who is a child. So the first Redwall book, the one called Redwall, was about Matthias, who was a very young but not necessarily child mouse, and he's going through this journey of first becoming a warrior. The second book in the series, Mossflower, meanwhile, is about Martin, who is unequivocally an adult and already an experienced warrior. So with this book, Jakes is still trying to make each book a little different. He wants a completely different kind of hero. So Mattimeo is not a young adult warrior or an experienced warrior. He's a child who is not yet ready to become a warrior. Now, that said, things do kind of get sloppy with this age-based premise. So on the one hand, Mattimeo clearly is described as and looks like a child, and as seen in this absolutely adorable illustration of him. The book says that the time that is surpassed between the book called Redwall and Mattimeo is 8 seasons, and seasons are roughly analogous for animals to years in Redwall logic. So maybe Mattimeo is supposed to be 8 years old. At the same time, age is clearly a more fluid concept in this universe because, spoiler, in the epilogue of this book, which happens 7 or 8 seasons later, depending on when you start counting, Mattimeo is 16 seasons old and he gets married. So is the point that this book is set in medieval times and, once you've bar mitzvahed, you literally are an adult? Or is the point that it's about mammals, and even though they're very humanoid in some ways, they nonetheless age like mammals and very quickly go from childhood to adulthood? It's hard to tell. But regardless, unlike many other Redwall characters who are vaguely described as young and could be older children or could be young adults, Mattimeo and his peers in this book unequivocally fills the role of child. Like, he has child playmates, he has parents who are concerned about his behavior, etc., etc. On top of that setup, as this being the first Redwall book that's really about a child, another key part of the setup is that it seems to be a very loose adaptation of the classic folktale, The Pied Piper of Hamelin. So the Pied Piper is the story of a magical flute player who drives away a swarm of rats from a city with his magical flute. However, the people of the city don't pay him or adequately thank him for his work, so he then takes revenge on them by taking away their children. So how does this line up to the plot of Mattimeo? Well, Mattimeo takes place 8 seasons after the book called Redwall, in which Redwall Abbey was attacked by a swarm of rats. In that book, a fox named Slagar, formerly known as, spoiler, Chicken Hound, was sort of, not really, not at all, but he says he was on Redwall's side in that fight. And after Redwall, sorta, not really, okay, not at all, but according to Slagar, causes the rats to kill his mother and leaves him disfigured after he's almost fatally bitten by a snake. He sees the need to take revenge, and the form of his revenge is taking their children and selling them into slavery. So we have quite the enticing setup for this Redwall book. We have this child protagonist in Mattimeo, and we have this Pied Piper of Hamelin inspired villain in Slagar the Fox. Now, that said, I'm starting to develop a theory on Redwall books based on the 4 that I've read recently and having read many more of them early in my life, and that's this. If you're actually interested in compelling thematic storytelling, then the best parts of these books are the first 50 pages. In its first 50 pages, this book seems rife with themes. So for one, Mattimeo feels at odds with the rigid propriety of the adults he lives with, who vilify him from everything from getting into fights, okay, that's kind of justified, to having terrible spelling. I mean, learn to spell, but their reaction seems really harsh to that. Slagar, his captor, meanwhile, is very much a victim of childhood trauma. Like the son of a career con artist, Slagar wasn't allowed to live anything but a life of crime and constant danger throughout his childhood. This leads him to grow up alone and nearly get murdered by Asmodeus the Snake. So his only sense of how to exist in the world, of how to make something of himself, is just becoming the most horrible villain he can become and taking things out on other children. In another type of story, you might get to a point where Mattimeo and Slagar begin to feel, even if it's only surface level, that they might have something in common. And perhaps further bridging that divide between Slagar and Mattimeo is Slagar's most prominent minion, a tiny rat named Vitch. Vitch, it's unclear, he either looks like a child or outright is a child, so Slagar uses him as part of his plot to infiltrate Redwall. Vitch is essentially being exposed to the same abuse by Slagar that Slagar was subjected to by his own mother, Sella. So, Vitch is kind of like Draco Malfoy in the last two Harry Potter books, in that he's, been brought into the dark side, but he's still basically a child. There's still some sense that he's not fully in control of his actions. So in a lot of other books, you might ask the question, would Vitch be able to break free and live a life more like Mattimeo's than like Slagger? But that's the thing. After the first roughly 50 pages, Redwall books stop engaging in this thematic exploration stemming from deeply unique characters and really just zone in on consistency and maintaining the Redwall world as it always is. One example of how Redwall kind of transitions from opening with being a book suggesting themes and unique characters to a book that sort of just has consistent rules throughout comes at around page 74. It's just been discovered that the children of Redwall have been kidnapped and the adults are trying to figure out what happens. And Winifred the Otter says right away, we should have never trusted that fox. And Matthias instantly objects to her bigotry. So if this were another kind of book, say Harry Potter, this would actually be the setup where we think Slagger is the main villain, but no, maybe he's just going to be this weird circus fox who entertains people in his funny mask. And actually the real villain is no one you suspect. It was poor Professor Quirrell the whole time. But because this is Redwall, and because, the mice and the otters, etc., are always good and the foxes are always bad, no, this thing that sounds like a setup for a twist villain, no, Slagger is just the villain. But overall, the world of Redwall is this big, timeless tapestry in which you have good creatures fighting bad creatures. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Brian Jakes describes good writing as painting pictures with words, and this book, Mattimeo, is filled with memorable images. For example, we get a naive young otter named Cheek who says cheeky things while following Matthias around on his quest to rescue his son. We get a poetry reading owl named Sir Harry the Muse who, means well, but no one really knows what to do with him. We get a secondary villain named General Ironbeak, whose plot to capture Redwall is rendered kind of slapstick and silly by his plain language. I want to live in the big red house. General Ironbeak is basically Veruca Salt if she were twice as evil and a bird. But because Jakes creates so many of these characters, we don't really get to know them that well. Cheek, who seems like such a great premise for a character, doesn't actually get that many lines in that book. Cheek doesn't get that many chance to get cheeky. And part of this is that the party that Matthias is a part of when he goes on his quest to save his son is comedically huge. So for one, you get the returning characters from the last book. You have Jess the Squirrel and Basil the Hare who are around on his journey. You also get this badger named Orlando Axe, who doesn't really add much to the story other than, I guess, showing that it's possible for a badger father in Redwall to not abandon his daughter. Take notes, Boar the Fighter. There's also a huge army of shrews that follows them along. And finally, there's this completely pointless hedgehog. He adds nothing to the plot. He doesn't have much of a personality, named Jabez Stump, who is also journeying along with Matthias. I'm starting to get the sense that Brian Jakes would have these panics when he realized, okay, I've written all these woodland creatures in my book, but I'm not doing enough with hedgehogs. So I remember my criticism the last time I read the book, Martin the Warrior, was the exact same thing. The main character, Martin, he already had traveling companions, Rose and Grum. And for some reason, Jakes decided Martin needs another traveling companion, and he'll have no memorable personality. You'll barely notice when he comes into the story and why he's there, but he's going to be a hedgehog, and his name is Palom. So Jabez, Palom, prove me wrong, but right now they are not my favorite characters in the Redwall universe. So other than building a universe full of characters, some of whom are quite silly and memorable, another way that Jake sort of paints his picture with words is by using repeating motifs. Now, lots of the time, the repetition between Redwall books is quite obvious. The personalities of various species, the hares being fast-talking and gluttonous, or the foxes being the tricksters and magic ones of the villains. But sometimes the motifs are quite subtle. So I mentioned Constance the Badger earlier, and one of her big roles in the first Redwall book was fighting against not the main villain Clooney, but making absolutely miserable his wretched sidekick, Redtooth. And I honestly wish someone had warned Mangees the Crow, who is really not that horrible as far as Redwall villains go, to stay away from this sidekick bashing badger. So in short, Mattimeo is an incredibly detailed adventure, and for the most part, not a hard one to follow. It's not an easy children's read, but it is still a children's book. And what's so great about it is that it manages to bring back a lot of what was beloved in the first Redwall book, while also building a completely new universe on top of that. It's a wonderful mix of aesthetics. You have the classic medieval adventure of Matthias and his questing party. You have the slapstick scene of Cornflower and those who stayed at Redwall fighting the birds. And you also have this weird underground cult led by a talking statue that seems to be collecting slaves. And the book is not without its themes. So one thing I noticed was the emergence of a red kite, so this eagle-like bird named Strike towards the end of the book. And I feel like some people who read this part feels, oh, this is a Deus Ex Machina. Don't actually know how to pronounce that. It's an easy way for the Redwallers to defeat the Crows. But I actually thought it came full cycle from the first Redwall book. So the first Redwall book opens up by introducing Redwall Abbey as this place that is open to all kinds of creatures that will heal all animals of their wounds, even if they might normally be predators to mice. Now, the first Redwall book is sort of about Redwall unlearning its pacifist ways and learning how to violently defend itself when a huge army consisting mostly of rats attacks them. The book is about the development almost of this anti-rat bigotry. And things kind of come full circle in this one, where the Redwallers again have to heal a potentially dangerous, potentially predatory animal, but he comes around and he helps them. That said, overall, this is not a great book for themes, and it's more just a book for images, because the most turbulent themes, they're going to disrupt the flow of Jakes' consistent word-based tapestry. So does the generational conflict between Matthias and Mattimeo come to anything? No, pretty much once Mattimeo is kidnapped, he feels guilty for disobeying his parents and matures into the warrior who allegedly becomes indistinguishable from his father. What about Vitch? Do we do anything unique with this unusually young, or at least young looking villain who has this unique relationship to the protagonist? Not really. What about Slagger? Does his uniqueness as the one villain to appear in multiple Redwall books play out after the first few chapters? Not really. He just is a kind of normal Redwall villain who's pretty mean and, spoiler, gets killed at the end. Or does he? This is the fox who survived the most deadly killer in the Redwall universe, Asmodeus the Snake, and he was notably not killed by the weapons of either Matthias the Warrior or Orlando the Axe. No, he fell into a ditch, and there's a vague description of him being buried, but he'd been brought underground by Asmodeus the Snake before. Something tells me that Slaggar the Cruel is still out there, planning his next revenge.